So, hello, welcome or welcome back to my channel, and it's time for another recent reads. Yay! And I have three books to talk about in this video. All of these are translated fiction. Two of these books were books that I chose for Women in Translation Month, which is a yearly booktube event that takes place in August, and it's one of my favorites because, well, I like reading translated fiction by, not just fiction, translated works by female authors. So yeah, let's start with the first one. This is Purge by Sofi Oksanen, and this was an interesting book. This book centers around two women named Zara, a younger woman, and an older woman named Alida. And this novel is set in Estonia from the 1940s all the way to 1992. And this time period is interesting because for the majority of this time period, Estonia was actually under the occupation of the Soviets, which started around the 1940s. In fact, it was a little bit complicated during the 1940s because there were the Nazi Germans also, and Estonia just sort of changed hands at that time. But around mid 1940s, I think, all the way until 1991, Estonia was under the Soviet Union as Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic, and it was up until 1991 that Estonia regained its independence. And that bit of history is, I would say, is quite crucial to this story as well. Doesn't mean that you have to know it, because I didn't know about that before I read this book, but it really is intertwined with the concept and the theme and the plot of this book. So yeah, like I said earlier, this book is about two women, Zara and Alida. The story goes like this. So one day Alida is just kind of like chilling at her house, and then suddenly a young woman just appears at her doorstep. And this woman named Zara, she's messy, she's scared, she's dirty, and she doesn't speak. She's trembling, and Alida just doesn't know what to do with this young woman, because Alida is someone who doesn't trust people a lot. She has been living through the Soviet occupation with so much paranoia and policing among the people, and so naturally Alida does not trust people, and so she has this kind of like dilemma, like what should she do with this young woman who just suddenly show up outside her house. And seeing the condition of Zara, Alida decides to invite her in and provide shelter for her, without really knowing why or where she's from. But we, the readers, would eventually learn that Zara is actually running away from two men who are her sort of like captors. These two men are sex traffickers. They took her from her home and then forced her into sex work. And Zara did something, and she ran away. She ran away and she reached Alida's house, where she would end up taking refuge. And at the same time, as we read this novel, we also learn more about Alida's history. Now, Alida is an old woman who is living by herself in this Estonian woods, in a small village. But the point is, she's living by herself. She has some friends, but she's not really like very tight with the community. And we learn that during the Soviet occupation of Estonia, Alida was some kind of a Soviet sympathizer. Sort of. This is something that's going to be further explored in the book. And with that, we learn more about her history and what actually happened to her at that time, and also her family and all that. And once we learn about the history of these two characters, we can sort of see that there are parallels in their story, parallels that may lead to some kind of connection between these two characters. But yeah, these parallels I find really interesting because it is tied very closely to the core of this novel, which I consider to be, violence against women. That is what I consider to be the main idea of this book. And both of these women, despite their differences in age, violence is something that is very much prominent in their stories. Like in the case of Zara, she faces violence in the form of sex trafficking, and also sexual violence. In the case of Alida, she has faced violence in the form of military occupation, and also control by the government during her time. And sexual violence especially is something that is featured heavily in this book. It's not just Zara, but Alida would her life would also feature bits of that as well. And what I find interesting is that adding on to that layer of narrative regarding violence is the constant I would say featuring of the aspects of domestic life, domesticity. I noticed that much of this novel actually takes place in a kitchen, which is something that I think we all can regard as something that relates to domesticity or femininity, or being a wife, something wifely, homely, and there's always that contrast of what goes on in a kitchen versus what is going on outside, not just the kitchen but also outside the house, the chaos, things such as war, things such as sex trafficking, basically the chaos and violence that are occurring outside the confines of a home. And I find that to be quite interesting. This book was originally written as a play, I think, and it was sort of rewritten with some modification into a novel. So I certainly could see how aspects of this story as a play there's a hint of it in this novel as well. How it sort of uses space, which I think is kind of interesting. So aside from how much of the story occurs in a kitchen, I also like how this novel features a lot of house chores, housework, things like making jam or cooking. I thought that is interesting because we keep on seeing these characters facing violence or the possibility of impending violence, but at the same time we are also seeing life going on through the acts of domestic chores. And there's this really interesting contrast between these two. Like, it's very obvious that the violence in this book is something that encroaches on regular people's lives. So yeah, something that I don't know, I just thought really interesting. Now, another thing, and those of you who have read this book might have an idea about this. There's this image of a fly, a big on the cover. In fact, it is actually a it's cut like this, which makes this cover really precious because it can get damaged easily. But anyway, this fly. At first, I actually thought this book was a science fiction, but turns out it's not. It's not a science fiction. I thought it was going to be like some kind of science fiction that would involve a lot of insects and flies. It was like, how did I end up with that impression? I don't know. But anyway, but still, flies are featured a lot in this book. Like, it is so deliberate whenever flies are written in the book. It is so deliberate. You can see that they are written there with a strong sense of intentionality. Like, it's not just a random fly, and there are a lot of flies in this book, and I feel like they sort of represent something. Could it be like I like to think of it as, the fly representing some kind of rod behind the facade of something that is proper, some kind of rottenness that has to be purged. Secrets that are dark, and in fact secrets do play a role in this book as well. But yeah, what do you guys think? Those of you who have read this book, what do you think about that? That would be really interesting to hear your ideas. Anyway, those are my thoughts about Purge by Sofi Oksanen. I give this book 4 out of 5 stars. Definitely recommend this one. Now, moving on to the next book. This is a translated fiction, a very small novel by Cocteau. This is called Les Enfants Terribles, and it was translated from French to English by Rosamond Lehmann. I picked up this book from the shelf. It has been on my shelf for quite a long time because I was interested in reading this one, but I picked it up because it was short. And like how some of my experience with short books turned out in the past, some of them are good, but quite a bunch of them are, didn't really impress me, and yeah, this book really disappointed me. It also disappointed me more because I thought it had such an interesting promise and potential. So what is it about? In Les Enfants Terribles, we see two young characters. One is a 14-year-old boy named Paul, and another one is a 16-year-old girl named Elizabeth. And these two, let's just call them kids. These two teenagers, are siblings. And Elizabeth has been taking care of her ailing mom. Their father passed away, so the mom is bedridden. And we could say that these two kids are growing up in an environment without much supervision or guidance of an adult figure. And I think you could sort of imagine where this book would lead to next with that statement. But yeah, what's interesting about these two kids is that they live in a sort of isolation away from adults, so to speak. The only main adult who exists in their life is this ailing, bedridden mother. But these two kids, they sort of develop some kind of game with among themselves. It's called The Game. And in this reality of the game, these two siblings would constantly try to exasperate each other, get on each other's nerves, and they would try to one-up each other. So there's some kind of childishness aspect of this reality called the game. But at the same time, in the game, these kids are trying to sort of have a reality that sort of mimics the real world. Okay, I just got distracted by some noise outside. Anyway, but the reality of this game also mimics what's in the real world, what they think is kind of like the reality of adulthood, or what the reality adults are going through. And this particular reality, their interpretation of this reality is particularly melodramatic because it involves things like relationships. And soon after that, they would invite two more friends, Gerald and Agatha, into this world of theirs. And let's just say that did not end in a very happily ever after way. I don't think that's a spoiler because the book itself in the cover is like this, and the title is called Les Enfants Terribles. So now, first on the things that I thought was interesting about this book. I thought this book had a lot of potential in exploring themes such as adulthood, childhood, naivete, innocence, maturity versus immaturity. What does it mean by children being innocent? You know, what is really the meaning of that? And from some of the more positive reviews, I definitely could glean through some of the ideas, but reading this book, I just did not feel convinced that this book explored those ideas in a very meaningful way. This book is fast-paced, it is short, a lot of actions happening, particularly involving these kids and also later their friends. And because these kids are dramatic with each other, things happen quite fast. But at the same time, because they are kids, the things that happen with them, the drama that happen among them also feels quite childish. And it's childish because they're kids. And they're kind of dumb. Which I think is a good way to really explore those themes, you know? And I suppose you can explore those themes, you can read those themes, but I just didn't feel like it was enough for me. And all I got from this one was just a vapid story about some vapid kids who think they know the world, but actually, as readers, we know that they don't. Yeah, and probably that kind of relates to a bit of a personal irk of mine, which is when someone who obviously does not know what it, you know, what life entails or what the world entails, and then suddenly they spout out these wisdom like, you know, the world is like this, the world is like that. Like, dude, you're 18, you don't know. You don't know how the world is. You know, I'm 32. No, I'm not 32, I'm 31. I'm 31. I don't even know what life is and what world is. And so you hear characters or even real people speaking like that, you just I don't know, it just sounds kind of grating to me. Like, yeah, maybe they do have some wisdom, but still, I have a bit of that cynicism towards those kind of statements, and I feel like these characters certainly embody that. And yeah, and I, you know, and then again, yeah, I did think that, yeah, maybe these characters are written that way, so the way that they are written could convey something else, and I personally do think that this book do convey that. If you tried and read this book, you might have a different interpretation of these characters as well. But I just didn't feel like the rest of the writing was sufficient to convey more, to support or to give something extra just beyond the portrayal of these kids as these vapid, dumb kids. So yeah, enough ranting. Let's get to the next one. This one is interesting, I think. This is Miss Chopsticks by Xinran. My second pick for Women in Translation. So this book was originally written in Chinese. It was translated into English by Esther Tyldesley. And this book was published in 2008. I think the last time I mentioned this book, I mentioned wrongly that this book is set in the 80s, but I think it is actually set in the early 2000s. Now, what is this book about? Miss Chopsticks is about three sisters who travel to the city of Nanjing from their village in order to earn a livelihood for their family. So their life in the village is very difficult, very rough, because they live in poverty, and on top of that, their family does not have any son. And this is something important, especially with the title, because in this book, chopsticks is the word that is used to refer to daughters. Because basically, in their village, sons are referred to as roof beams, because sons are thought to be able to support families. Sons are more solid in a sense, and therefore sons are more desired. But their family happened to have all daughters, 6 daughters, and daughters are considered in the village as chopsticks because they are not as strong as a roof beam. So yeah, practically misogyny. And this is going to be a theme that runs through the entire book. Basically, how these girls, being daughters, are always taught to consider themselves as inferior, but when they get to the city, they learn that maybe there are other ways to think about themselves. Who knows, right? So, when these sisters get to the city, they are welcomed at each of the places where they would find employment. Each of them would find employment in different places. So one of the sisters has been in the city for a while. She is working as a waitress at a restaurant. Another sister, she has always been considered as dumb and stupid because she does not know how to read and write. She is considered as slow, and therefore is constantly looked down on, even at the village. And this sister works at a place that is kind of like a spa. And the last sister, who has been to school, she works at a tea house that also happens to contain a lot of books. So basically a book cafe. So their experiences in the city would eventually reveal things that they have never known. They would end up discovering so many things about the world outside the village, and also knowledge about how the society they live in works, the differences between the society in the village and the city, the kinds of things that exist in the city, good or bad. They are exposed to things such as systematic oppression, social inequality, sexism, which they have always been under, but they've never been really told that they've been living under this particular system. Things such as power abuse, corruption, all of these things were exposed to these sisters as they sort of navigate their life and their jobs in the city. So, yeah, in other words, we can say that these sisters are experiencing woke moments in the city where they are exposed to these different ideas. And on top of that, they are also exposed to the possibility that their life could be different. Now, that is an interesting premise, I would say. It's not the most original premise, but it is a premise that is quite universal, I think. And I'm sure a lot of people who read that would be able to connect with that premise. Something that I find really interesting about this book, however, is the tone, or how it is written. And I think it is contributed by how it was originally written in Chinese, and also how it is translated. Now, with the translation, I thought that a lot of expression in this book were translated in a very literal way. Such as there is one particular Chinese expression that I used to use a lot in primary school, 晴天霹雳, which means lightning in a clear sky. The meaning of that expression is to receive a shocking news and during a moment of peace, right? But that expression is literally translated into like lightning in a clear sky, which I thought was kind of strange, because when you use that expression in Chinese, you don't really literally think of lightnings and clear sky, even though the expression literally means lightning and clear sky. But you don't think about that. You don't visualize that. You literally just visualize something about news when everyone is chill, you know. But it was translated that way, and it sort of provided this strange visualization of its language in my head. So it forced me to suddenly visualize lightning in a clear sky, you know what I mean? So that is just one of the examples of how language is kind of translated in this book. Another expression is fish belly white, which is usually used to describe the color of the morning sky when it just starts to become white, from dark blue to white, you know, that transition. I'm not sure if I see that kind of descriptive language used a lot in things that are originally in English, but I certainly use that expression, 鱼肚白, when I was writing essays. You know, I was writing Chinese essays when I was in school. So that was translated literally as well, and it made me visualize that color of the sky literally. But at least, you know, that's descriptive language. It is intended to make you visualize things. And also some of the things like Chinese puns are being explained in this book in a careful and patient manner, which I thought was interesting. Usually those things would derail the plot, but I feel like in this case, in the case of this book, it doesn't really derail the plot because of something else, and it's because most of this book is written in this strange, heartwarming tone. It feels like I was reading a children's book, and even the plot feels like the plot of a children's book, because we see these girls coming from the village where their life was difficult, and they arrive in this town, a city, Nanjing, and everyone, well, nearly everyone, but especially those that they will work with, their employers, their colleagues, welcome them. These people are written as nice, kind, supportive, understanding, patient, rarely gets angry at them, if ever, and it's just so optimistic. It is just so nice and fluffy and sweet. But there is also an element of pity that is kind of lampshaded in this novel, but for the most part it feels very sweet. Now, that is not where it ends though. The tone is certainly sweet. Like, let me just say, one of the tones of this book is sweet. That kind of sweetness you can find in a children's book. That hyper optimism you can find in a work written for children. So you have these really sweet narratives about these girls going to town and getting jobs and getting help by these people, and these people ease these girls into towards the life in a city, and introduce them like how in the city people are like this, and this work you have to do this and that. Once in a while we will get moments that are dark and cynical. For example, sometimes the girls would reminisce about their lives in village, and they would think about how certain girls would choose to kill themselves because of some very difficult situation. Or suddenly this book would sort of segue into into commentary on abuse among police officers, or abuse among power abuse related to government officials, and it would get quite serious about that. So there is this constant light and dark, light and dark, light and dark in this book that I thought is just kind of jarring because their tones are different. So there's this like strange contrast that keep on happening in this book. And it's not like the entire book is constantly gray. It's like it's sweet and then it's dark, and then it's sweet and then it's dark, and sweet and dark. It's like it is strange. And to be honest, I actually kind of dig that, because you know what? One of the things that I like is consistency in tone, and one might think that this tone is not consistent, but it's actually consistent in a way that it is consistently going in and out of this darkness and dark and optimism. So it is consistent like that, which makes this book reads very strangely to me. But I feel like that also makes it kind of memorable. So yeah, those of you who have read this book, what do you think about how it is written? It would be really interesting to hear input from you guys as well. But yeah, that aspect of this book was certainly quite surprising for me. I did not expect that at all. Anyway, those are all of the books that I read that I want to talk about in this recent reads video. I think it's like what, 33 minutes. I'm doing this because the time is in white and the wall is white, so I can't see it. Yeah, but before I end this video, let me just talk about some of the things that I'm currently reading. I'm still reading Moo by Jane Smiley, and I feel like I finally figured out how I really felt about this book. It's like watching a TV series that you find interesting, but at the same time you just don't have the bandwidth to binge watch. Like, each episode is just so dense, it's so much information, you just cannot stomach more than one episode at one time. So this is how that book feels like to me. I'm also currently reading The Leopard by Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa, translated by Archibald from Italian to English. Still reading the short book. It is short, but it's taking me a long time. LA Woman by Babitz. A short story collection by Richard Yates called 11 Kinds of Loneliness. And last but not least, something that I just started recently. This is Hell of a Book by Mott, a contemporary novel. And I happen to have the large print edition, which makes it look like a children's book. But I like it. It's good for my eyes. I can feel my eyes thanking me right now. But yeah, those are all of the books that I'm currently reading right now. Have you read any of those? Have you read the books that I talked about in these recent reads? What are you currently reading? right now. So let me know, and until then, I'll see you in a different video. So take care. Thanks for watching. Thanks for stopping by. Bye bye.